Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about China's new national security law and what it means for the future of Hong Kong. While everyone is distracted by the pandemic, China is taking the opportunity to expand its power in Hong Kong, sparking a wave of protests. This is part of a pattern of a broader power struggle between a bolder, more aggressive China and pro-democracy protesters who won't have it. How did we get to this point? What does the future hold for Hong Kong? And what does this mean for US-China relations and the possibility of a new Cold War? Just before we start, don't forget to subscribe for more political analysis videos every weekend and hit that bell notification while you do it. So as you may have heard, China has introduced a new national security law that bans secession, subversion of state power, foreign interference, and terrorism. What this effectively means is that it is now illegal to advocate for Hong Kong independence. Many NGOs will run into problems, and China can now bypass Hong Kong security forces and send its own secret police into Hong Kong. This security law was not passed by the Hong Kong legislature, but rather by the Communist Party in Beijing, bypassing Hong Kong's own laws. At the same time, the Hong Kong legislature passed a law making it illegal to disrespect the Chinese national anthem, whatever that means, effectively curbing freedom of speech. And if you do, you could spend up to 3 years in jail. And it's these actions that have led to mass protests on the streets of Hong Kong this week. And the crackdown has already started, with someone being sentenced to 4 years in jail for rioting, and a satirical TV show being suspended for insulting the police. So how did we get to this point? Let's take a quick look at the history. Now, as you may have heard, Hong Kong has a special administrative status within China, and this stems from the 19th century, when China went through something called the Century of Humiliation, where it was never directly colonized, but European powers forced China into unfair trade deals and concessions. So when China lost the Opium War to Great Britain, China was forced to give up Hong Kong to the British Empire on a 99-year lease. And in that time, Hong Kong was developed into one of Asia's most important financial centers. And although it was not a democracy, it was a British colony, it did have guaranteed individual liberties such as freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and the rule of law. But in China, Hong Kong was always seen as an occupied territory that rightfully belonged to China. And so in 1997, when the 99-year lease ended, it was agreed that Britain would give Hong Kong back to the Chinese on certain conditions. Those conditions were that Hong Kong would be able to retain its autonomy, controlling its own local affairs, and that Hong Kong would preserve its freedoms, such as the right to vote, the right to freedom of speech, and a free press. And so Hong Kong has its own currency, its own passports, its own legal system, and its own system of government. One country, two systems. And this would last for 50 years until the year 2047. And initially, the Chinese respected this agreement because in 1997, Hong Kong accounted for 18% of China's total GDP. Today, however, that figure is less than 3%, and so as Hong Kong's relative economic importance has declined, China has felt more comfortable tightening its grip. As early as 2003, China tried to implement a national security law similar to this one, but was forced to back down when 500,000 people marched on the streets. They've tried to introduce a pro-Chinese education system. People selling books banned in China have mysteriously disappeared. Pro-democracy lawmakers were kicked out of parliament for insulting China. The list goes on. And each time, China was met by fierce protests, whether it was in 2003, 2012, 2014, 2016, or 2019. Now in 2019, the protests were against an extradition bill that would allow the Chinese to extradite prisoners in Hong Kong to China, where there is no rule of law or fair trial. Fortunately, the protests forced China to back down. Last year, people were afraid of being dragged away to China by the secret police. But now with this new security law, that won't be necessary, because the secret police can come to you. And all of this is possible because Hong Kong is not in fact a full democracy. Its chief executive is not elected but chosen by a small committee approved by China. The legislature is elected. However, 30 of the 70 seats are not elected by popular vote, but by the business community, who are pro-China because being pro-China is good for business. And so the result is that pro-democracy parties have won the popular vote in every single election since 1997, yet the legislature has always been majority pro-China. So the only way for Hong Kongers to have a political voice is through protest. The events of last year show that protest works, resistance works, and that's why they don't want you to do it. But it does come at a cost, and that cost is the economy. Hong Kong is an important financial center. It has the third largest stock exchange in Asia, and many multinationals are based in Hong Kong rather than mainland China because of its secure legal system and its strategic links to the rest of the world. But companies might leave Hong Kong due to social unrest. Last year's protests already caused a 40% decline in tourism. This gives Hong Kong less leverage over China in the long run. The protesters are in a catch-22. Protesting puts pressure on China and works to slow down some laws, but hurts the economy and weakens Hong Kong's position relative to China. Now, China won't go so far as sending in troops, because that would collapse the economy, lead to mass immigration, and investment would dry up. After all, stability and predictability is important for business. So why is China doing this now? At the end of the day, having a successful, relatively free society within your own borders is inconvenient for the Chinese dictatorship. Now, traditionally, the Chinese Communist Party gets its legitimacy from producing a good economy for its people. But the pandemic has put that into question, and so I think that this is in part a way to distract the mainland Chinese people from the government's mishandling of the coronavirus and the economic downturn. On top of that, many people in China don't see Hong Kong as this bastion of freedom that we see it as in the West. Many feel that Hong Kong is a product of the century of humiliation by Western colonial powers and rightfully belongs to China. And if the Hong Kong legislature won't pass the necessary laws, then the CCP will do it themselves. And this timing is also convenient for Xi Jinping, because the rest of the world is distracted by the pandemic. And what about the international community? Now, in response to all this, the Trump administration has declared that Hong Kong can no longer be considered autonomous, and so in accordance with the bipartisan Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, Trump has revoked Hong Kong's special status. You see, Hong Kong was exempt from many of the tariffs and restrictions that mainland China is subject to. Now, on the surface, this seems like a good move. You see, although Hong Kong no longer represents such a large slice of the Chinese economy, it's still important because it still forms China's primary link to the rest of the world, with Hong Kong's stock exchange being the third largest in Asia. So there will be some pain, but I think it could also backfire. You see, by removing Hong Kong's special status, Hong Kong becomes even less economically important to China, and so China has even less reason to give it special treatment. On top of that, these measures will hurt Hong Kong more than they will hurt China. Many American companies are located in Hong Kong because of its preferential status. So many American investors will leave Hong Kong if that special status is revoked, leaving America with even less influence in Hong Kong than it had before, and Hong Kong more dependent on China. Meanwhile, China won't be too badly affected. Most likely, only tougher measures will have a real impact on China's behavior. But the problem is that now that the world is dependent on China for medical equipment, China has leverage, and so it's tough to do anything that will have any real impact. But there's a broader pattern that I think is important. This pandemic has brought the 40-year trend of increasing globalization to a grinding halt. At the same time, tensions between China and the United States are rising. Now, for a long time, when people talked about the possibility of a new Cold War between the United States and China, this was dismissed as far-fetched because the American and Chinese economies are so deeply interwoven. But this pandemic has exposed some of the problems with that. Suddenly, it doesn't seem like such a good idea to produce your medical equipment in China. Suddenly, dependence on China and trade with China is seen as less beneficial. And so I think that in the next few years, we could see, at least in some areas, that this pandemic will lead to a slow decoupling with China. And all the ingredients are there. Trump's anti-China rhetoric has struck a chord with the American people.
China, 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 China.
His trade war has raised tensions, and now the pandemic has reinforced the divide. Now, even if somebody else becomes president, anti-China sentiment is rising in the United States. Polls show that since the pandemic, anti-China sentiment has surged, with 2/3, 66% of Americans now having a negative view of China. So even if there's another president, the American people will not have an appetite for cordial relations with China. And things like the gradual takeover of Hong Kong, China's threats against Taiwan, and China's expansion into the South China Sea will only reinforce that negative perception. And as a rising power, now China is increasingly seen less as a valuable trading partner and more as a threat to the power of the United States. And that's exactly how the two powers see each other, as rivals. This pandemic will have a permanent impact on international politics, and I really think that we are at the cusp of a second Cold War, and Hong Kong will be one of its battlefields. Now, as for Hong Kong, China won't crack down fully today or tomorrow. They don't need to. They will continue their slow-motion coup until they have full control, slowly increasing their influence as Hong Kong becomes less relevant and goes from one country, two systems, to one country, one system, and one party. 2047 is coming, and China has its eyes on Hong Kong's freedoms, and only mass resistance and the support of the international community can stop it. If you want to support these videos, consider becoming a Patreon. Thank you to all our Patreons for making these videos possible. Like, share, and subscribe, because this was my take.